Greetings, friend. Welcome to this review of the Darksword Armory Warmonger sword. Today we will be discussing the component parts of this sword, going over its handling characteristics, and reviewing a couple of cutting tests to ascertain how this sword performs as a functional fantasy piece. Darksword Armory designed the Warmonger to be a fantasy barbarian sword inspired by Norse mythology. And you can see this sword also comes with its own unique scabbard to fit that theme. This is a wood core scabbard wrapped with fur rather than leather, and it even has a bronze shape with a snake head to complement the design in the guard and the pommel. Now the Warmonger is also a limited edition piece. There are only 1,500 of these swords out there, and that probably accounts for why this sword costs so much. It costs between $875 and $910 US, depending on whether or not you want the sword sharpened. I opted for the sharpening option, so I paid the more expensive price. Statistics-wise, this sword, from tip to pommel, measures 44.5 inches in length. The blade itself, from tip to guard, is 32 inches in length. The handle, from guard to pommel, is 8¼ inches in length, and the whole sword together weighs 3 pounds 9 ounces. Altogether, that makes it a very interesting sword with a very unique design. Before we dive into the Warmonger review, there are 3 swords I need to introduce because they're inevitably going to interject biases into how I perceive the Warmonger. The first of these is a sport fencing epee. This is a one-handed thrusting sword used in the sport fencing context. And I have trained with this style of sword since 2019, and I'm very comfortable with this type. Now, that's not as big of a problem as the black sword here on the wall behind me. This is a Windless Battlecry Agincourt sword. I am extremely comfortable with it, and it handles like an extension of my arm. I train with this sword predominantly in the Italian longsword style, and I've been doing so since 2021. Now, the third sword here, I also do in the Italian longsword style, as I would the Warmonger. This sword is the Vindaris by Darksword Armory. It is a much heavier sword than any of my other swords. It weighs a full pound more than the Warmonger, and while I only use it for the strength and endurance training, it is going to interject biases because it's a bit bigger than the Warmonger sword here. If I set them side by side, you can see that there's a height difference. And the same goes over here with the Agincourt sword. You can see the handle's a bit longer and the blade's a lot longer and even a bit wider. So those are biases I want you to take into account when I'm discussing the Warmonger sword. Oh, and the most important bias is none of the swords. This is not my sword. This is a Christmas present for my little sister. So consequently, I'm probably going to be unusually harsh on this sword, or at least I'm concerned I will be, because this is a Christmas present, and I don't want to deliver her a sword that she can't enjoy and can't use. The first component part of the Warmonger sword we are going to discuss is the blade. Now, this blade, as I've said before, from tip to pommel, it measures 32 inches in length. It is forged from 5160 high carbon spring steel and has been tempered at its core to a Rockwell hardness of between 48 and 50. Along its edges, it has been tempered to a Rockwell of 60. Now, the point of balance on this blade is right at the teeth of the decorative ricasso. So I can rest the teeth on my fingers like this, and the sword will just balance there contently. Now, one little critique I have about this particular blade, and that's when I sight down the edges and have to look specifically for this little minor issue, is there's a slight swell deformation in the blade about here. And it's just when you sight down the edges, it doesn't look completely straight. But that doesn't affect the cutting performance of this sword at all. It doesn't have anything to do with the thrusting performance or even the visual performance. You can't see it here as I'm showing it to you. You have to actually be sighting down the blade and looking for it. Now, from the decorative standpoint, this sword is very pretty. The runes down this blade are very crisp and clean and very, very clearly defined. They look very, very nice, and you can see how the light catches in them very beautifully there. They spell out in Norse-style runes, "Let my sword be your last warning." Very thematically appropriate for a barbarian sword. The ricasso of the blade is a little bit deceptive because most might look at this and think that it's only decorative, that there's really no functional value here. But I would say to them, you can't be further from the truth on that, because the contours of the bronze here actually fit the hand really, really comfortably. It feels like a secondary handle here, and it's great for point control, and it's also great for being able to wield the pommel in its own strike. So the ricasso is actually really well done, especially when you have the flare of the teeth there to prevent the hand from sliding over the ricasso and onto the sharp part of the blade. So overall, I would say this blade is really well done. So we are now moving to the bronze guard here of the Warmonger sword. And as you can see, it's quite small proportionally to the rest of the sword. The ricasso is almost as wide as the guard is itself. But all that aside, the guard has some beautiful decoration on it. You can see the details on the snakes. They have scales along the chin. You can see they actually have their eyes and their fangs. It's very well done as far as the bronze work is concerned. Now, my only real critique of this guard, aside from its underwhelming size, is this bronze tongue here that comes out over the blade on both sides. And that is, it's so close to the blade, it's hard to get in there with a cleaning rag to clean away water or to apply oil or to wipe some kind of like fruit juices off of, stuff like that. So that's really my only criticism of the guard, but otherwise it's a very beautiful piece, and it is one of the big reasons why I singled this sword out for my sister for Christmas. The handle of the Warmonger sword looks pretty plain and demure next to the decorative features of the guard and the pommel and even the blade. But what this handle lacks in aesthetics, it more than makes up for in function. This is a handle that seems to be designed with functionality in mind before aesthetics, and it really does show. The diamond shape here fits the hand really nice, and these pairs of risers interspaced down the handle also lock in a finger for each hand very comfortably to create a very secure and comfortable grip on this sword. The ridges here actually deserve a special mention of their own, independent of the grip, because they're almost in line with the edge of the blade. So when I grip the sword like this, I actually know where my edge is at all times based on where the joints of my fingers here are. And that lends itself particularly well to edge alignment when cutting targets, because you always know where the edge is. There's no guesswork, there's no trying to adapt to the sword to learn where its edge alignment is, it just is there. And that's really good even for a beginner who has never cut before, who has never even handled a sword before, my sister being one of them. My sister actually commented after cutting with the sword for a little bit that as long as she knew where this ridge was on either side of the handle, she knew where her edge was, and that really helped her with her first test cutting made with her sword. And you will see that later in the test cutting section later in this review. So overall, this handle, while it's plain, while it's unornamented, is a really excellent functional handle. So our final hilt component on the Warmonger is the pommel. And you can see that this is a historical scent stopper shaped pommel with the added fantasy element of snakes twirling up it to terminate at the peen. These snakes they don't look as clean as the ones on the guard, but they still have eyes and little details such as teeth and scales, so they do look nice and appropriate to the pommel. The way they wrap around the pommel actually gives some really good texture on this pommel. So if I hold the sword like this, like I naturally want to, I can slide my hand down against the pommel very comfortably, and the snakes actually give that added reinforced grip to supplement the handle. Now, I caveat that with one unfortunate criticism, and that is that these scales are sharp. They are not smooth at all. So when I'm holding my hand like this, if I shift it ever so slightly by accident, it feels like I'm feeding my hand through a meat grinder. It really chews up the hand. Now I can mitigate that by wearing a glove, and that does help a lot, but sometimes I will find certain areas on the scales will catch against the fabric of the glove too. So it can be a minor nuisance when you have a glove on. It's just an unfortunate fact that this particular fantasy design with having these scales raised like this interferes with the ability to use this pommel as intended. It is time now to discuss the handling characteristics of the Warmonger sword. And although it has a lot of aesthetics to it, it looks like a decorative fantasy sword. This sword is actually a great functional sword from a handling perspective. This long handle feels very comfortable in the hand. The ridges help the finger lock in tight so that I have a comfortable grip on this sword, a secure grip on this sword, and that spine there aligns me very nicely with the edge. But I also really like the proportions of the blade length to the handle length, because I have a lot of control with this sword. I can do whatever I want with it, and it is a very responsive blade. It thrusts nicely, cut nicely. I have a lot of lever action in this handle. It's very comfortable to use. It's very fun to use. And having that nice point of balance set by the ricasso allows me to spin it around even one-handed. I don't use it as great one-handed as I do two-handed, but I can train up to that. That is definitely something that I could do were this my sword and I could invest the time to train with it. So it feels very great in the hand. And the other promising thing is when I put it into my sister's hands, who is untrained, has no experience with swords whatsoever, she can also use it similar to how I'm doing it. And she makes it look easy. So this is a very wieldable sword even for a beginner swordsman or an untrained swordsman. So as far as handling, this is a sword that even the untrained could take out and have fun with, maybe even learn technique with, because that handle does encourage good edge alignment. Now, also from the handling standpoint, the ricasso is really nice, that having that bronze on it, so I can grip the sword like this, do half swording. The tip is really responsive when I do it this way, so the thrusts are really nice. I can set that point and go. I can adjust that point and go, even if I wanted to over grip it, maybe say like this. Still have great control over that swing, even if I do like this. Great control, lesser degree because my left hand's the lead hand, but still great control. It's an excellent sword from a handling perspective. That's all I can really say about it at this point. I'm glad I chose this sword for my sister, or rather she chose this sword for herself, because this is a sword that if she ever set her mind to it, she could actually use. Yeah. Okay, forehand blow. This is my best blow with a sword like this. Oh, look at that. Very nice and clean. Okay, so this is, we're doing backhand. This is my weaker side. Ooh. Okay, let's try, we're using the ricasso. Let's see what happens. Okay, again. That's happening again. Ooh, that's... Look at that cut. Barely even see it. Very nice. Nice. There you go. Nice. Let's see. Ooh. Yeah? Pull it out. Can you pull it out? Yeah. Well, that's all the blade. That's a nice divot. No, it shouldn't. It looks fine to me. Ooh. Let's see. Ooh, let's see. Ooh, very nice.
It has lost its head.
Very much. So, oh, that's clean. Look at that.
Oh, yes.
Not bad on this edge. Ooh. That was nice. Look at that clean edge. Nice. Very nice. Call that dead. Nice. Having covered the component parts of the Warmonger sword, discussed its handling characteristics, and reviewed its cutting performance, it's time for the overall conclusion. And my conclusion regarding the Warmonger sword is this is an excellent longsword. It has both the fantasy elements and the functional elements required for a true functional fantasy sword. Now, from the fantasy side, you have excellent detail in the bronze guard, in the bronze pommel, in the runes running down the blade. It's all really sharp and really pretty from an artistic perspective. Now, from the functional standpoint, its handle design and its point of balance right here at the ricasso put together make a very responsive, nimble sword. For the beginner swordsman, this is an excellent sword because it guides your edge alignment and it's not unwieldy and it responds to your commands. When you saw the cutting tests, those were my sister's first time cutting with a sword at all. And yeah, on the first forehand cut and then the first backhand cut, she had a little bit of trouble. But after that, she pretty much dialed herself in, made her adjustments without any issue, and then was able to have a great time cutting up the pumpkin with her sword. So from the beginner's aspect, or maybe even the aspect of somebody who only wants a casual backyard cutting sword, this is a great sword for that task. Now, for the intermediate and advanced swordsman, this is also a fun sword. It might even be more fun for people who are trained in proper technique because the sword becomes extremely responsive to good technique, which makes it a pleasure to wield, makes it really, really fun to swing around and thrust with. And then having that unique ricasso also allows you to practice half swording. It also makes the point control really, really fun. So between the handling and the decorative aspects, this is a very, very nice sword. And the only real barrier to it and the big negative criticism on it is its price point. As I said early on, it's between $875 and $910 depending on whether you want to get the Darksword Armory sharpening service. So the price can be a barrier to some, but this is the kind of sword that if you really like the design, but you also want a functional sword, it might actually be worth the investment because it's a sword that you can have a lot of fun with beyond just display. That's not always the case with really expensive fantasy swords. So from that in that context, this is an excellent sword. So that's really all I have to say about this sword. I've done my best to give you as much information as possible so you can make your own decisions and opinions regarding this sword. So without further ado, go forth and do with the knowledge what you will.